Depth of field is generally defined as the area behind and in front of a subject that's deemed to be acceptably sharp and in focus. Images with a shallow depth of field show only a small portion of the scene in focus and the rest blurred, while images with a large depth of field show either the whole scene or the majority of it in focus. One of the main ways in which we can control depth of field is by adjusting the aperture of the lens. As a general rule, a wide aperture with a smaller f-stop, such as f1.8, will produce a shallow depth of field, while a smaller aperture with a higher f-stop, such as f13 or f16, will produce images with a much more expansive depth of field. Aperture is, however, not the only thing that determines how much depth of field your images are likely to show. Something else which determines depth of field is the distance between yourself and the subject. If you capture an image of a flower or another subject with a macro lens, you'll find a fairly standard aperture, such as f4 or f5.6, will give you a far shallower depth of field than an image taken further away from the subject with exactly the same aperture. Cameras with smaller sensors and smartphones struggle to produce the same shallow depth of field as DSLRs or compact system cameras. This means the photographer using a camera with a small sensor will often need to use a particularly wide aperture lens to get the same kind of results as you can on a full-frame DSLR. It's often thought that wide-angle lenses produce more depth of field than longer ones, but this isn't quite the case. The reason for this is that for a fair comparison to be made, the subject would need to occupy the same proportion of the frame. So, you'd need to move closer to the subject with a wide-angle lens, or further away with a telephoto lens. Trying to take the same image like this, using the same aperture, would reveal depth of field to vary only marginally, if at all, but the images would still appear differently because of how much of the background you're capturing, and what proportion of the frame it fills. Many photographers avoid using particularly small apertures, such as f16 or f22, as an effect known as diffraction affects most lenses when used at these settings. This effect blurs the image slightly and reduces the fine details in a scene, so a wider aperture and a change in focus position is often a better idea. Narrow apertures are, however, very useful in product and macro photography, where the closer subject distance requires a smaller aperture to keep everything in focus. Your camera may have a control that lets you preview depth of field before you take an image, and this can be useful if trying to isolate a specific subject from its surroundings or to make sure a range of distances are in focus. It's important to remember that what you consider to be acceptably sharp is also influenced by the size at which you view a print or image and the distance from which you view it. It's more difficult to see subjects slightly out of focus when they are viewed at a smaller size, just as it's more difficult to appreciate this when you are further away from them. For more tips and advice, subscribe to our channel, visit us on Twitter, Facebook or Google+, or check out wexphotographic.com/blog.